Hi friends, I am here today. This is going to be longer than my normal little short videos, but I'm here because several people have told me, especially this year, that I should share my testimony publicly, and I'm not really sure how else to do that. I'm not super comfortable in front of a camera. I'm much less comfortable with eyeballs staring at me, but I think that the power of God is highlighted in it and the sufficiency of Scripture, and so I do think it's worth a share. So go ahead and listen if you want. This will be on YouTube and I'll post it on some social media platforms. But let me go ahead and say this will be longer than my little short videos, which I mostly started trying to find a way to share devotionals with my now college age students. This is my first year as an empty nester. They live in 3 different cities. So it's just something I tried to share, and I shared it publicly because I don't know, why not? But it's just fun to share, I guess, what God's been teaching me. So this will be much longer, but I will try to keep it as short as I can. I will start by saying I came from a broken home, like a lot of people in my age. I'm in my late 40s. We're going to hang on to that number as long as we can. But a lot of people my age also came from broken homes. That's not so unusual. I did go to church as a child. I remember hearing all these stories, like boys fighting giants and overcoming them, fish swallowing people, heard about Jesus, but none of it really connected together to me. It just seemed like isolated stories, almost like a book of fairy tales. And at some point, I made a profession and said I believed, but I know my mom swears that I showed fruit. I remember wanting to know if the water in the baptistry was warm or not. I don't know if it was genuine. Only the Lord knows. What I do know is, as a teenager, I rejected it all. I ran. I mocked Christians. I thought it was all a bunch of hocus pocus, meant to make people feel better about themselves or whatever, maybe feel better about life. I don't know exactly what I thought. I just rejected it. I mocked it, and I embraced the world's way of doing things. Also, it's worthy of pointing out, as a teenager, I was also very insecure. I felt like that kid, Pigpen, in a Charlie Brown show, in the Peanuts show, that has the cloud of dust all around him. I felt like I carried my own invisible cloud of dust, that everything I did was tainted and not good. It was just rotten. I was always told I was really smart, but I didn't feel smart. I felt, again, tainted. And I felt like I couldn't do or have or be nice things because I would just bring them to disaster. So that put me in a unique place as this Christ-rejecting, angry, but also insecure young person. That when I was 19 years old, I was basically easy pickings for a predator. I didn't know that at the time. I got involved with a man who was, at that time, 36. I was 19. So I was old enough, he didn't have to worry about jail time, but I was young enough, it was still pretty darn gross. And he was not an attractive person. He flattered me. He made me feel special, like he saw my mind, he saw how unique it was, and all the things I wanted to hear secretly. But once he kind of had me under his thumb, the dynamic changed a bit. He began to show a little bit of a darker side. He started talking about times like his ex-wife had left him, and he had her and her boyfriend in the sights of a gun and did not pull the trigger but thought about it. And over time I realized some of these were basically threatening me, that if I left. Long story short, after a period of 4 years where I was the breadwinner, I had the job, all the things that were financed, washer, dryer, those types of things, furniture were in my name. But I found child porn in his possession. And I decided that I would be better off dead than with him. So I left all the things still financed in my name. I paid them off, but left them with him and fled. It took me some time to get away, but luckily for me, he was also a big pot smoker. So all that, like those threats, kind of dwindled and faded. If you don't know much about pot smokers or marijuana smokers, they're not super known for the follow through. And he was definitely did not follow through with the death threats. But all of that experience confirmed to me that invisible dust cloud that I had always imagined myself having. I now felt and was convinced that I had proven myself to be dirty and vile, and so I began to act like it. I began to use men before they could use me. I began to live just a truly immoral lifestyle. I embraced the world's ethics, the world's sexual ethic. I embraced the world's like live your truth and look out for number one and follow your heart and what's good for the gander is good for the goose and all of those things. I embraced them fully, and I lived them. And it got me into a very lonely place, for one thing. I thought I had a bunch of friends, but as it turns out, I did over time get involved with this. By this time, I think I was 24, 25, got involved with this young man. Not really involved. We dated 2 or 3 months, I believe, when he had leukemia and it relapsed. And I, being already insecure, feeling I had cloaked a lot of my insecurities with alcohol and this lifestyle. But with that reality sitting there, I thought, what kind of a nasty human would dump somebody because they have cancer? So I felt that I had no choice but to go with him when he moved to another city to get a bone marrow transplant, especially because this person had a mom with a strained relationship and she was the only one going with. So I felt that it was my obligation to go, and I went. Needless to say, I spent most of my nights in the hospital. The mom didn't care for me much, and I don't blame her, frankly. I was a pretty horrible human, but and I cannot blame her. This is her baby. But I became a convenient scapegoat for anything that went wrong. I did spend almost every night at the hospital, which, as he got worse and worse, once the transplant happened, he began to spiral downhill after a few weeks, and it got really horrible. It got to the point that I was getting very little sleep. There's always somebody checking. There's crashes happening. There's the nurses gave me the codes to the bed linens because they could not keep up with his body malfunctioning. And it was horrible. And I was just at my limit. I was in a city where I knew barely anybody. I barely knew anybody. I spent most of my time I did have to get a job, but I spent my time at the job or at the hospital. I showered at the hospital. It was crazy. And I was getting probably 2 to 3 hours of broken sleep a night by this time, when he really started to go downhill, and changing the linens and all kinds of things. And one day he asked me not to come back. And honestly, that's all I needed. I was so mentally, physically, and emotionally done that I left. I later found out he asked his mom not to come back too. Of course, she did come back. But all that to say, he died soon after that. And I sent him an email. I was grieving. There were so many things I wanted to say, so much I couldn't say to him, so much that I wish I had said, and I tried to pour it all into this long email. To be honest, I was probably intoxicated when I wrote it, and sent it to his email account, knowing he would never get it. Well, apparently some people did, and all the people from the city that I had met him in and the group that we hung out with apparently got a hold of it. I got some nasty grams from several of them, and they all dropped me like a bad habit, which was a little bitter for me, because I thought they were friends, and at my lowest point, I had no one. So now I was here in this city, and around this time is when I met the man who's now my husband. I jumped straight back into my immoral lifestyle, my worldly sexual ethic and hookup culture, and in this case, it ended me up pregnant. We had been together for a month when I found out that I was pregnant. I don't even know that I knew his middle name. And all the consequences of my worldview came crashing in on me the moment I looked at that pregnancy stick, that positive pregnancy test. And I realized at that moment, I was either going to have this baby or not. I knew about abortion, but I knew even then, as an atheist, in my in my sick and twisted worldview and my mixed up brain, I knew I could not kill a baby and live with myself. So abortion was not an option, but suicide was. So for me, it came down to a choice between, is there some truth? Is there some reason or purpose to life? Is there some point to getting up in the morning that's not follow my heart or look out for number one? Is there an actual reason to exist or not? Because in my way of thinking, if the worldview I had lived up until this point was the reason, was all there was to life, if all we are is a bunch of molecules bumping around and reacting to stimuli and things like that, it would be immoral to bring another person into this misery, this pure hell. But if there was some truth, some reason, some purpose for life, I wanted to find it. So began my truth quest. I, by this time, was about 3 months pregnant, and I've told people this, that I went to McKay's and got a Bible. To be honest, I'm not sure if I went to McKay's and bought a used Bible, or if I used the man who's now my husband, if I used his old confirmation Bible, which I'm not going to tell his story, but I'll tell you mine. But I know I picked up a Bible at some point in my pregnancy when I realized the baby wasn't going to miscarry and I could not do an abortion. And I was like, so basically we have a few months here. And I picked it up and I said, God, if you're real, you're going to have to prove it. I'll read this book, but I want you to know I do not believe a word of it. So if you're real, you're going to have to prove it while I read. And my whole idea was, if he hadn't proved it by a certain time, suicide was my way out. Well, long story short, he did. As I read, I remember starting in Genesis. I didn't know where else to start. You pick up a book, you start at the beginning, right? So I started in Genesis. And I laughed at some of the stories I read there. Some of them I was like, that's ridiculous. That could never happen. Others, like Noah's Ark, at the same time I was kind of laughing at what to me seemed like a silly fairy tale type story. I also noticed things that they didn't teach me in Sunday school, that it wasn't just animals 2 by 2. It was a little more complicated than that, something about clean animals. But I tucked that away and I carried on. And it wasn't really until I got to Ezra, and I know it now just because I know this word. It was around the last chapter of Ezra where I was reading. And I was reading how the Israelites had found the law and Ezra had read it, and they were separating themselves from their foreign wives. They'd all come out and they were standing in the rain, hearing the law, and they were weeping because they were broken for their sin, and they were separating themselves from their foreign wives and setting up a system to do that. And I was sobbing. At this point, I was feeling very vulnerable. I may have been a young mom by now. I may have still been pregnant. A lot of that's fuzzy. There was a lot going on. But I do know that sorry, I'm going to get away from my dog who's tearing up sticks right under me, and I'm sure you can hear it. I began to cry and weep, and I was asking God, how could you do this? How could you let these moms and these kids go without provision? Because I knew back in those days there was no Kroger, there was no way for women to get a job. And it broke me. And all of a sudden, in the middle of my weeping, I realized I was talking to God as if he was real. So somewhere in there, between Genesis and Ezra, I had crossed over to believing. But I still didn't get it. And I continued to read the Bible. And I did start to believe. I remember getting to Mark and reading about the demoniac, the boy the father asked Jesus if he could cast it out. He said he kept throwing him into the fire and all these things. And Jesus said, if I can, all things are possible to those who believe. And the man said, Lord, I do believe. Help my unbelief. And I realized that was my prayer. I needed to believe. I needed him to help my unbelief. And so I continued reading through the Bible. At that point, it was probably fits and starts. I'm not really sure, but I began to hunger for it. I began to want to read it, to want to know more. I remember getting so excited to get to the New Testament, but I still felt that dust cloud around me. I still felt like this couldn't be for me. This couldn't be for me, because I had mocked him. I had laughed at Christians. I had laughed at God. I laughed at the idea of Jesus. And so it wasn't, by this time I know, we were married, thankfully, by God's grace alone. This man became my husband. By the time we had 2 kids, I longed to go to church, but I it was some time before I did. It wasn't until child number 3 came along. I think I was actually pregnant with her. We moved back to my hometown because I had been hospitalized while child number 2 was 5 months old, 5 or 6 months old, somewhere in there, and got pregnant almost right away. And I wasn't sure how to handle all these babies, and I didn't feel well a lot. So we moved back to my hometown, and I started going to church. That was my first time to go to church. I was so excited. I was ready. And it was somewhere in there, something that was said in the pulpit, something I read in the Word, and something that I heard on a Christian radio station that made me realize that God's grace was a gift. And when I give somebody a gift, if they were to look at it and just kind of throw it over their shoulder or be like, oh, I couldn't, I'm not good enough for this, and never even open it, never even try, it would hurt me. And I realized that God was extending forgiveness to me, even though I had mocked him and derided him, even though I had embraced such a horrible worldly lifestyle and considered so many crazy things I have not even gotten into here. And I realized it was a gift he was offering, and to refuse to even look at it just because it was a twisted kind of pride. And so I remember in the car crying and saying, I accept it. Lord, I accept your forgiveness. I accept it, and thank you. And have lived as a grateful convert since then. I still read his word every day. I love it. I don't read it because it's a thing on my checklist, although for a while it was. I read it because if I got up and didn't read it, it would feel like I forgot to put my clothes on or forgot to brush my teeth. I can't even imagine. It's so weird. I find a way, no matter what, to read it every day. I love it. And it was through his word and talking with him that he saved me. Some of the details centered in with teaching, but I was his long before I stepped in the door of a church. I wanted to be with God's people. I wanted to be with his word, in his word with others, not because I felt like it was the right thing to do, but because I saw it here in this book, because I saw the Acts church and what they meant to each other. And I knew I needed that accountability. I knew that I was messed up inside, and I needed people to go, whoa, you're off track. If I had had that when I met that guy who was 36 way back when I was 19, I don't know that I would have ever derailed quite that far, but I didn't. I let him isolate me, and then I stayed in a area of isolation for a large part of my adult life. And that's what Satan wants to do. Satan is the ultimate predator. He wants to isolate you from God and from people who will point you to him. Don't let him. Get this book. It is worthy, and it is such a great story. You will see your story in its pages. You'll see that not everything in the Bible, our pastor says, not everything is proscriptive, but it's descriptive, meaning not everything that's in the Bible means we're supposed to do that. Read with some sense of discernment. Read and ask God to give you his spirit to help you see what is and what is not. Some things are in there merely because that's what happened. And that was honestly one of the things that struck me first time reading through the word. The first time I read through it was, it didn't read like a make-believe story. In the make-believe stories, the bad guys were always really, really bad, and the good guys were always really, really good. And in this story, they were all a mess. They were like me. There was Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times. I mocked him. Peter full-on denied him. And yet, he gave the first sermon. He became foundational to the new church. Just reading the word and asking God's Holy Spirit to open it up to you, that's the best way. And I promise you, it's worth every ounce of trouble, even if you have to put it on a to-do list and check it off every single day, or whatever it takes to get in the habit. Start the habit, because someday, if you read it with his spirit guiding you, it will become the best part of your day. It'll become the part that you long to spend all day on, and you know you can't, but that's okay. Someday you'll have, if you belong to Christ, every day, all day, for all of eternity in his presence. Right now we have the written word, then we're going to be in the presence of the word, and it's going to be amazing. But I want to say this to you today. If you don't believe, that's fine. Neither did I. God can handle your unbelief. He's big enough. He's heard it from more people than me. He's heard it from more people than you, and he can do amazing things. But you have to be humble enough to realize that you need him. I definitely realize that. And don't let the enemy take your pride and twist it around to where you think, well, I need him, but he doesn't need me. No, he doesn't. Of course he doesn't. It's his grace that reaches out for you anyway, that reaches out for me. But also, that don't let the enemy make you think you're too big of a sinner for God to save. There's no such thing. There is literally no such thing. If he could save me, he could save anybody. So God's grace is sufficient. Jesus' sacrifice was enough. His word and his spirit is what we need. Talk to him. Read his word. Talk to him about it before you go seeking other people. And then check yourself. Check yourself historically. What things have stood through the ages? Don't just listen to pop culture preachers. Dig into what the people said back in the first century church. You can find those things online for free. Dig into Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to say it, who wrote around the time right before Rome fell. Dig into these things and find these threads that have lasted, because the truth has never changed. No matter what culture says, no matter how you may feel about it, truth has never changed. God's word has not changed, and it is sufficient, and it is a great book. If you read it with the right attitude, I read it with the wrong attitude, and he changed my life. But have an honest, open heart. Be willing to change. You never know what he'll do with it. Love you. I hope you're blessed by this. Have any questions, feel free to email me. I welcome honest questions. I'm not going to open a public debate because that's just not what I'm here for. If the Lord led me to debate somebody, I would. But I just want to say, he loves you. He loved me despite my flaws, and I still mess up. Don't judge Christ by the Christian. Not by me, not by any other one. Certainly not by celebrity preachers. Judge Christ by his merits alone. And don't judge Christianity by the people who practice it and fail. Because like Peter, we might really screw it up. Judge it by Christ alone. God is good. I promise you that. Love you.